Welcome everyone to those who are joining us. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded, but before that, we invite you to check out the Campaign for Grade Level Reading social media pages. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third, and on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. Use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and GLR Reading to share any thoughts that you have from today's webinar, and we will be sure to retweet. Once again, the webinar will begin at the top of the hour. Okay, once again, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We will begin shortly. Again, we invite you to connect with us on social media. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third, and on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. Again, feel free to use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays to share anything you learn or any thoughts that you have from today's webinar, and we will be sure to retweet. Okay, my name is Sierra Sanchez, and I am the producer for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Before we start, I have just a few housekeeping tips before we begin. First, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. Share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure to select panelists and attendees when you share, so that way we all know who is here. All attendees are participating in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement through the chat box and the Q&A box as well. Please post any questions that you might have in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last 20 to 30 minutes of the webinar to respond to those questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all of those who registered. And the webinar is also being live streamed on our Facebook page as well. Lastly, all resources linked in the chat will be shared in a follow-up email shared to everyone who registered. And there will be a brief evaluation survey posted during the Q&A portion. If you can, please respond to that. That just helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Also, before we start, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. We will be continuing our exploration of summertime strategies for addressing the Learning Loss Recovery Challenge next week with a webinar led by our partners at National Summer Learning Loss. On February 9th, we will discuss a variety of EdTech tools that can be leveraged to support accelerated learning, hearing from superintendents that are deploying various tools. The registration link for these upcoming GLR Learning Tuesday sessions will be posted in the chat box. Also, on February 9th, we will continue our Crucible of Practice Salon series, hearing from several of the key partners in the successful coalition in Roanoke, Virginia at the 12:30 time slot. A link to that registration page will also be posted in the chat box for you to register. Joining you now is Sarah Torian, a consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, COVID-19 and Learning Loss, What Data Tell Us About Moving Forward. Despite the chilly temperatures outside my window right now is a critical moment for planning for summer programs that will follow a year unlike any other for children and communities across the country. Right now, about half of U.S. students remain in all remote learning, and another 15% are attending school in a hybrid model, resulting in significant amounts of lost instructional time and feelings of isolation for many. So as we think about how to tailor summer programs to respond to the challenges posed by COVID-19, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading turns, as it always does, to the data and the research to use that as a guide as we seek to galvanize partners in communities and states across the country in ensuring that all children have an equitable opportunity to learn and to succeed. So in today's session, we'll review what the data tell us about the impact on children of COVID school closures and disruptions over the past 10 months. And then a panel of researchers and experts will engage in a facilitated conversation about what we can do now to plan and prepare for summer programming that accelerates learning opportunities for children who have lost ground during the pandemic and also responds to their social and emotional needs. And to begin that conversation, I am incredibly honored to welcome and introduce our panel for today's conversation. Joining us to moderate today's webinar is Denise Fort. Denise is the Senior Vice President for Partnership and Engagement at the Education Trust, where she brings strategic leadership to the organization's efforts to engage policymakers and diverse coalitions of advocates in demanding and securing equity advancing policy changes at the national and state levels. Denise spent 20 years in progressively senior congressional staff roles and also served in the Obama administration U.S. Department of Education as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary. So welcome, Denise. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the other panelists, and then I'll pass the mic over to you to moderate the conversation. First up, we have Emma Dorn. Emma is the Global Education Practice Manager at McKinsey & Company, where she supports McKinsey's education work across early childhood, schools, vocational training, and higher education, including deep expertise in applying advanced analytics for social impact. Emma has led McKinsey's response to COVID-19 for school systems, supporting states and school districts in understanding and applying best practices for reopening schools in person, in hybrid and remote learning. So welcome, Emma. Next up, we have John Gompertz. John is a longtime leader in nonprofits and government organizations devoted to civic engagement and to creating greater opportunity for children and youth. Most recently, John served as President and CEO of America's Promise Alliance and also was Director of AmeriCorps in the Obama administration. So welcome, John. Also excited to welcome and introduce Dr. Jennifer Sloan McCombs, Senior Policy Researcher and the Director of the Behavioral and Policy Sciences Department at the RAND Corporation. Jennifer's research combines implementation and outcome data to provide practitioners and policymakers with guidance on how to improve programs, specifically summer programs, and promote positive outcomes. Jennifer led a longitudinal study of the National Summer Learning Project and an evidence review of summer programs. Welcome, Jennifer. Next up, we have Dr. Beth Schuler, an assistant professor of education and public policy at the University of Virginia, where she studies education policy, politics, and inequality with a focus on efforts to improve low-performing K-12 schools and school districts. So welcome, Beth. Also joining us as a commentator today is Aaron Dworkin, CEO of the National Summer Learning Association. Before taking leadership of NSLA in 2019, Aaron served for 12 years as president of the After School All-Stars National Network, a nonprofit providing free after-school and summer programs to 90,000 low-income students in 20 major cities across the United States, guiding the organization through tremendous growth and helping it create 4 new signature national initiatives. So welcome, Aaron. Thank you all for joining us today to share your insights and your expertise with those in our network as they are thinking about how to leverage the summer months and summer programming to reach and support children. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Denise, to guide us through that conversation.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am thrilled to be here with you and looking forward to the conversation myself. So let's just get right down to it. Emma, thank you for joining us. You have done really significant work in this area and actually was a part of a webinar from last week. And those who were able to attend the webinar last week heard you explain the data, highlighting the impact of school closures and lost instructional time on students. And we're posting a link to that session in the chat box for those who missed it. But could you please give us a brief recap of that data to set the stage for our conversation today?
Sure, absolutely happy to. So if you want to move on a couple of slides, would love to talk just a little bit about the level set and the data of what students have lost in terms of learning and what that might mean. So a recap from last week, we took a look at the Curriculum Associates assessment data that had been done in school in the fall, which really measures the learning that students had or didn't have in the previous year, so in the spring, so due to the spring shutdowns. And what we found is that on average, students were about 3 months behind in math, where you would normally expect them to be, based on similar students in previous years, and about a month and a half behind in reading, where you would expect them to be. And what's important to note here is that this was only from the spring, and we've had several months of disruption, obviously, since then. But also that students didn't just learn less reading and math due to these shutdowns. They also experienced much broader losses. And if you look at the broader literature out there, some research done in the UK, where you might gather I originally come from my accent, by Ofsted, which is the UK's monitoring organization. And what they found is that students had actually regressed in some stages. Students were no longer able to hold a pencil when they had been before. Fine motor skills were regressing. There were physical impacts. Students had gained weight over the lockdown. There were no organized sports anymore. And then significant mental health issues have been reported in the US and elsewhere, with anxiety and depression increasing. And so as we look forwards, I think thinking about the reading and the math is critical, but also thinking about that whole child and everything as students come back. So what we did next is we took a look at, well, that was what happened in the spring. If we take a look forward, where are we going to be by the end of this school year? And so as we think about summer learning, what is going to be the input to that summer learning in terms of where are students going to be? And so if you come to the next page, what we found is that if nothing is done, if we kind of continue in the status quo, the same number of kids, currently virtual, hybrid, in person, same kind of quality of remote learning that's happening right now, we're probably going to end up hitting the end of this year with kids on average 9 months behind in mathematics. And what's particularly worrying is the inequity of that, with students of color potentially 11 to 12 months behind. And remember, this is of a 10-month school year, so this is over a full year behind where we'd expect them to be in mathematics. Now, there are things that can be done between now and the summer. We can work to improve the quality of remote learning. And if we got it up to the same quality as some of the top virtual schools, we could limit that to 6 months. We also, at the time, this was in December, projected what would it take a look like if students, the status quo continued till January, and students were back in school from January 1. And that looked like more like 5 months of learning loss. So there are things that can be done, but even in best case scenario here, we're talking about kids coming into the summer about half a year behind in mathematics, at least.
Emma, that is really compelling data, but can you unpack it a little bit more for me? So losing 11 to 12 months of learning, or even 5 months of learning, what do the data points tell us that you are sharing? What does that mean for kids? And what do they mean for our nation in terms of the economy and our competitiveness?
Yeah, it's important, right? If we look at high school graduation rates, if we look at the relationship between student learning and economics and student earnings, if nothing is done to help these kids catch up, there are going to be long-term implications. If we take a look at the next page, we can see that with 7 months of learning loss, which is kind of a best case scenario at this point, with rising rates, a new variant, a lot of concern about the investment needed to improve education between now and the end of the year. If we look at 7 months of learning loss, that translates to about $60,000 to $80,000 less in lifetime earnings for the average student. And then if you scale that up to the economic perspective, students who are a population that is less educated translates into less innovation, and it translates into lower GDP growth. And we project that with 7 months of learning loss, you're looking at around $170 to $270 billion every year in GDP that will be lower. And that's about a 1% decrease in GDP. And that's not just a one-off, that's every year from 2040 onwards as these students come into the workforce.
Those are really mind-blowing numbers. With all of that and the data you just shared, what does the research suggest in terms of a possible response? What do we do right now, and how can we use the summer to try to curb these losses and accelerate learning?
Absolutely. So, I mean, as I said, the two immediate things we can do right now is we can try and improve the quality of remote learning, and there's been a lot written on that. The other thing we can do is where we can and where it's safe, we can get kids back to school. But unfortunately, if we look at the next slide, with rising case rates across the US and with a new variant that just adds uncertainty, and with a slowdown potentially in the vaccine rollout, you still have a lot of kids who are in virtual only schools. And this is as of the 20th, about 42% of kids were still in districts that were only offering virtual learning. And the Burbio, which is the organization that is tracking this data across the US, has tracked that over a third of US kids actually haven't had the opportunity this whole year to attend in-person school, which really raises the need to think of the summer. And so if we think of kids, how are we going to help kids accelerate their learning? I think there's three things we can think about. And if you come to the next page, I can outline those a little bit. The first is we can obviously provide them with more time. So we can extend the number of hours we give to kids to learn the material they're going to need to learn. And that can look like more time in the day. It can mean more time in the week, or it can mean summer learning. We could also give them more attention. Studies have showed, and we're going to talk a little bit about the role of tutoring, but increasing the quality of learning by either smaller groups or one-on-one or one-to-two high intensity approaches can help students accelerate. And then the last is just focusing the content. So maybe students don't need to learn every single piece of the third grade curriculum, but what it is it in third grade that they're really going to need as a building block for fourth grade? And how do we still expose kids to grade level content while giving them the scaffolding to really understand and access that content? And so if we look across the world, systems across the world are doing things already, thinking about this. And this is from a UNESCO survey. This is slightly out of date now. It was from June, July. It's the last time that UNESCO surveyed decision makers across the world. But decision makers were looking at all of these things. And for example, the UK has set up a tutoring core, an amount of purchase has basically set aside money for their schools to use a variety of different approved tutoring organizations, especially targeted at high need kids. And so two examples I really want to focus on and that really translate into the discussion today, where there's a real evidence base, and we have some of the folks involved in that research on the phone, so I'm really excited to hear more from them. But if we turn to the next page, those are high intensity tutoring and acceleration academies. And I think we've talked about high intensity tutoring on a number of these webinars before. We've talked about the huge potential that this approach has, that kids can get 1 to 2 years of additional learning in mathematics over just 1 year. And so that's a very exciting approach. It's not cheap, at $2,500 per student per year. If we were going to roll that out across the US, we estimate that's about $66 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, but if you compare it to that GDP loss number that we're talking about, it's a real investment in the future. And then I think the other thing is these acceleration academies, where over 1 week of an acceleration academy, kids were able to get actually 3 months of reading learning. And so if we could give every kid 2 weeks of these vacation academies, maybe you could catch up all of the reading that they weren't able to progress on during the pandemic. And again, the price tag here is, if we roll this out across the US, of $42 billion. So I'll pause here. These are just some ideas and a little bit of setting the scene. I'm really excited to hear from some of the experts we have on the line as well around how to actually scale this and put it into practice, because I think that's the real challenge now.
You bet. And thank you for that presentation, Emma. In the chat, there's a link to the slide deck. So hopefully people have grabbed that. There is really good data in there. And I think the most important place for us to go now is to talk to some of these experts. And I think as Emma presented, and what we really want to talk about today is summer learning. The urgency is clear. I think that was made very clear in Emma's presentation. But at the same time, and most of you are involved in doing summer programs as well as year-round programs, summer has been a critical time to ensure children and economically challenged families have an opportunity to receive academic supports and enrichment. But we all know that this summer is probably unlike any other. Hopefully we've learned something. What do summer programs need to do differently this summer to respond to the urgency of the moment? And I think I'll ask Jen to kick us off on that question, and then we can also have others respond if that makes sense.
So I think that it is important to think about sort of like what we know about effective summer learning programs first, that we want to hold constant, right? And then think about how they apply to these situations. So what do we know about effective summer learning programs? We know that small class size matters. Like a lot of these places have small class sizes. Having something that is intentionally focused is very effective. So there are all kinds of summer learning programs that can be effective at reaching their goals, depending on what they are. But what's pretty consistent across them is that they need to be intentionally focused based on student needs. So really honing in on what students need at this given point in time and ensuring that sort of the activities and curriculum match that. A lot of the summer learning programs that have been studied that are voluntary, which I think is a space where we're going to be right now, really combine academics and enrichment programming throughout the day. So full days for the younger kids, making it easy for families, lowering barriers to entry on that. And then providing sort of the concentrated academics, but also fun, enriching activities that are going to drive attendance, because attendance is critical, right? So if kids aren't there, they're actually not going to be benefiting from these programs. It's like one of these things that sounds like a no-brainer, but is actually really difficult to pull off, and you have to be intentional about it. And I think it's also helpful to think about what Emma alluded to earlier, which is that kids not only have lost academics, right? They have lost opportunity as well. Opportunity for social interaction, like lots of places don't have sports. There are all sorts of things that kids haven't had access to. And sort of like incorporating that enrichment component is particularly helpful. And I think it's also worth considering what other needs students may have. And whether you want to have sort of like intentional programming focused on that. So for instance, Emma also discussed for many students, they're also having some mental health issues. And so we know that sort of like targeted interventions around that area, summer is an opportune time to provide that as well. And so I think that districts, community partners, et cetera, can be thinking holistically about what students need and how to provide them. And I would also advocate, before I let other people chime in, to not only be thinking about this summer and planning now, but think about next summer too, because this is not something where it's going to be one moment and we're all done and kids are fine. This is something that needs to be followed up on. And in terms of our research, we find sort of the strongest benefits in terms of language arts, mathematics, and social emotional outcomes for high attenders over 2 summers. So this idea of sort of the consistency of additional time and the use of time is helpful.
You really have keyed into a couple of things. We need to be planning now, and we also need to be planning for the long term. So our summer programs, and then the last thing, we've got kids, children, students, young people who have experienced significant lost instructional time, but also what you mentioned, the isolation, the trauma, both health-wise, unemployment, homelessness, food insecurity. So we also need to be thinking about how we use these opportunities for social connections. But that it's exactly what a lot of summer programs do already. But with the intensity laid on of COVID-19, how should programs be thinking about staffing, training, partnerships? John and Beth, if you want to jump in on here, Jen, you're welcome as well.
Just make sure.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much, Denise, and thanks to the campaign for putting on this conversation. It's already, the things that have been said have been terrific. I want to really underscore what Jennifer just said. And I love the data that Emma presented. And then I worry that we're going to try to solve this all in 2 seconds flat. Oh, we have this period called summer, and let's just jam all this learning. We lost all this time on task. Let's get all the time on task back in these great 2.5 months, which would crush these young people. They would reject it, their parents would reject it, and they have all these other needs that are perhaps less easy to track, but could be more profound, and could be more profound about their capacity to learn. If kids are bringing all kinds of experiences that have been very profound and disturbing, it just doesn't really even matter how much time on task we give them until we attend to those needs. And I think, I don't know about you guys, but I think it's going to be weird to be with people again. Like, I need to ease into being with people again. And I think kids are going to need to ease into being with people again. So I think summer is, and the flexibility that summer offers is actually potentially especially powerful right now. I think that Jennifer's point about thinking about this over time, like this still is a big thing happening in our country, in the world, and in each individual's lives. We are not going to correct for that in a minute. And so thinking about sort of an arc of activities and learning that can begin to set this right, I think is really very much the right way to think about this.
Go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, thanks, Denise, and everyone for being here. So I would just, in terms of thinking about staffing, a few things occurred to me, some of which others have already alluded to. One is that I think one thing that seems important, probably always, but even more now, is to the extent possible that we create opportunities for students to stay with the same adult, to have some kind of consistency of staffing throughout a summer program, whether it be academic or other enrichment kind of focused. Emma already mentioned the Vacation Academies program, sometimes called Acceleration Academy programs, that I had the opportunity to study, and that I think capitalized on a lot of the best practices that Jennifer mentioned around summer programming. Although these weren't initially implemented in the summer, they were over week-long vacation breaks, winter and spring vacation breaks. These were programs for which the district, although you could imagine other organizations kind of running the show, selected teachers they considered to be really highly effective to work with struggling students. And this was in the context of schools that were undergoing turnaround, so very low performing school systems in the state of Massachusetts. And so they had a highly effective teacher working with a small group of about 10 struggling students in a single subject over these vacation breaks. And we found positive effects on academic outcomes, but also on non-test based outcomes, things like reductions in exposure to exclusionary discipline. And those gains in terms of discipline were concentrated among the kids who stayed with the same instructor the whole program. So it does seem like relationship building is really important, probably more than ever. The second thing I would say is that, to the extent that programming does end up needing to be virtual in the summer, or needing being a kind of, you judge that word for yourself, but to the extent the programming is virtual, there's kind of a silver lining, I think, in that, your pool of teachers or staff members is expanded, right, across the district, the state, the country. And so, we know teacher quality is really inequitably distributed across schools and districts. Virtual programs have a lot of downsides, but one good thing is they open up possibilities to really get the best teachers in the country more face time in front of the students that might need it the most. And so I think, thinking really big about staff quality, especially if you're online. And the final thing I'll say is, I agree with the other panelists that, certainly we need to be empathetic, to take into account the trauma and isolation students have experienced in this period. But I also wouldn't entirely shy away, and I don't think anyone's suggesting this, but just to reemphasize, shy away entirely from, rich academic content, tailored to students' needs and experiences. Because I think that, we want to keep in mind that many students really haven't had great opportunities, as the data kind of bears out, for academic engagement at all during this time. I think many may be hungry for it. And one thing that could help build relationships with, caring adults is to collectively engage with rich content, right? Let's read a great book together and discuss it. I had the opportunity to study a national virtual summer school program, the National Summer School Initiative. And this was one thing that seemed to really help with the engagement there, was just the selection of excellent texts, really great books that got kids to come, to show up, to engage. So, I think accounting for trauma and giving kids the supports they need doesn't mean the absolute exclusion of, some academic content and engagement with that kind of, with rich texts and other content. Thanks.
That is, that's an excellent point. And especially because we are still talking about learning and engaging. So the rigor and the availability of curriculum that kids want to engage with is going to be really, really important. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah, Denise, can I build on two things that John and Beth brought up? And one is around sort of the sort of merging together, sort of Beth and John's point on sort of like the academic content and thinking about it. And I think that Beth like drives home this real point, like academics is not punishment. Like if you're providing high quality academics, like that can be engaging and fun, and kids actually really do love to learn. So I think that that's something to keep in mind. But the second is that John's point alluded to, sort of like giving kids 6 hours of reading instruction every single day for 7 days a week. It's actually ineffective, and that's not how people learn best. And so you really want to draw on sort of like the learning science, which is like bits over time. It's basically why our school day is set up the way it is, where you have sort of like blocks of time, you're moving from section to section, is what works. Because eventually, I think we all know it ourselves, even just thinking about what we do. It's like you come to a point where you're just like overloaded and you are checked out. Like adding more to you is not going to help. And the other thing that I'd like to bring up, which is around sort of like this, the idea of staffing, which talks about training that you might want to think about for teachers too, right? So lots of programs provide training for their academic teachers around the curriculum, around sort of expectations for, how the site's going to run, how we're going to run our, enrichment camp, et cetera. But I would also potentially add in some training around what to look out for in terms of trauma and potential mental health. Because a lot of times in classrooms, those types of issues, when kids are sort of like acting those feelings out, it comes across to teachers as being a disciplinary problem and treated that way. And I think that sort of like what people might want to look out for and train teachers to be aware of that. And then also really make sure that you have counselors and psychologists potentially on staff and on site who can help push in and support kids who might need it, because we may see greater need for that this summer than in other summers.
Yeah, can I, Denise, can I just jump in and add a little bit? I think that even more than usual as well, we need to think about how parents and caregivers think about what's going on. There may be an incredible desire to offload their children for a little while after spending a year plus locked up with them. But there might also be concern and anxiety around having their kids in different spaces, and so that's two further thoughts on this. Um, Summer has always had this sort of wonderful feel, including the learning part and the experience part of it. And I don't think we want to lose that. I don't think we want to try to turn this into some sort of drudgery that parents sort of treat the same way that sometimes they think about school. The second is, and we don't want things imposed on kids that parents reject. The second is to also consider the ways in which parents, and the campaign has been brilliant about this, and I don't want to lose it in this context of summer, has been brilliant around parent engagement. So what is it that parents, if we enlist parents as allies in this smaller block of time called summer, what is it that they can work with their kids in concert with whatever programming is going on to accomplish in this block of time that re-enters kids into learning and gets them in a place where they can learn better over time? I think Alejandro is on from Springboard, and maybe he can post something in the chat about this, but I really don't want us to lose the parents in this conversation. And the campaign, as I said, has been terrific about this historically.
That's a brilliant point. I mean, there are a variety of models out there, and you guys are definitely honing in on what should be some of the, sorry about that, some of the key factors that need to be in program design. Can we talk about that a little bit more? Like there's so many different models and approaches, but how do we think program providers, their community partners, should be thinking about program design to ensure and promote equity? Because that's definitely the frame that EdTrust looks through everything, but also prepare students for success holistically, with whole child success as they return to school, hopefully in person next fall, whenever. What are some of those key things that in program design that we should be thinking about here? Jen or Beth, do you want to take that? I don't know who's my best expert here.
I'm not sure that there's a best. So I'll talk about one piece to kick us off, and then sort of like we'll go around and loop back. So I won't go through everything, but I will talk about the intentional use of time. So this is where I think sort of like everything hones down to this piece, like how you set up your program to accomplish what you want with children and youth during the period of time. And to do that and to do it effectively takes some pretty sophisticated planning and logistics, right? Because as soon as those things are out the door and people aren't making good use of their time, you suddenly have a less effective program, and actually a less engaging program, right? Because when kids are bored, when teachers are confused, instructors are confused, like that's not a good climate for anybody. And so really honing in. And so if you're focused on sort of like those 3 or 4 content things, like I think Emma was pointing people to think about like what are the most important skills that kids need at different grade levels, and where they are lacking, develop a curriculum around targeting those, like make effective use of time, which means giving sort of your instructors the materials that they need, a sense of what to do, how to ideas for differentiating instruction, and the same thing with enrichment, right? They're like the intentionality of what we're doing with children and youth really makes a difference. Relationships aren't formed by magic. And good outcomes aren't formed by just being with, good intentioned people. It has to do with the activities that we're engaging the children in. And so really, like, I would plan any type of enrichment activities just as carefully. And if you want to do something around the social and emotional piece, like, think about how that gets embedded throughout, like not only like potentially a standalone, but sort of like, what are those key values that the academic instructors are going to put into their practices, your enrichment instructors are going to put into theirs, to be really able to think about that. So that's my one practice piece, and then I will stop and turn it over.
Thank you for calling out, especially on the socio-emotional, that just layering it in is really not how you get at it. That the SEL work is really systemic work. I really appreciate you bringing that out. Beth or John, anything about program model design?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in with a couple of thoughts. One is sort of when we're thinking about at least the more kind of the academic programs that Emma mentioned, the sort of high dosage tutoring and acceleration academies. I think one thing to keep in mind is that, the sort of type of instructor is really going to vary depending on kind of the model of the program. So, although a licensed certified educator is often kind of our kind of the sort of gold standard, one-on-one tutoring probably requires a different skill set than kind of managing a small group. And so experienced teachers selected on merit might be best able to staff, smaller group academic programming, while you might be able to get away with less experienced staff for kind of a one-on-one type of program. So, thinking about staffing in that way. And then the other piece that I think is probably important to think about is, we've already sort of set the stage that, these losses are not universal, right? There's most likely going to be a pretty dramatic increase in inequality in terms of, the growth in achievement gaps. And so, I think we do want to be targeting the students who, are likely to have the biggest losses during this period for acceleration opportunities. At the same time, there's sort of a delicate balance of avoiding, creating stigma for students. And so I think it could be useful to give some thought to figuring out how to target in ways that don't stigmatize. So potentially targeting whole organizations with higher concentrations of students that are likely to have experienced big losses in opportunities and outcomes, rather than individuals, if the funding permits it.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. I agree with everything that Beth and Jennifer just said. I would not overlook the potential for high dosage tutoring delivered by people who are in national service. This is the kind of setting where national service members with the right kind of training can actually make a huge impact, both because of what they deliver, but also because of who they are. The near peer, the power of a near peer or a cool young person doing this work, or actually an older adult who brings different qualities to the setting, is potentially really important in not only delivering product, but opening a young person to their own capacity and desire to learn, which will propel forward over many months and many years. So as we think about what the models are, and we think about the value of high dosage tutoring, I'd also think about who might be involved in doing this. And we also know, in the category of other big problems, youth employment is a big challenge right now, and national service has always had this sort of genius quality of being able to accomplish a couple things at the same time. So as we think about what, let's also think about who, and let's think about whether national service members either delivering directly or in a role as rallying volunteers to deliver various things, the value that they can produce.
I would also encourage communities to think about their own partnerships, who they have, what kind of nonprofits are in their community, and think about about how to bring community partners and school partners together. In a lot of communities, some of the out of school time providers have actually been helping kids during the school year as well. They have relationships with kids and families. They can be a recruitment vehicle. There are many districts who have successfully partnered with community-based partners for enrichment activities. So I think that there are a variety of models, and really looking to how you can leverage the resources in your community to meet the needs that you see for children and youth is important. And in terms of the staffing models, because like in our study, like our gold standard is even higher in terms of like teachers in front of it. We're like not just teachers, but having grade level and content experience, right? So that's like the high bar. And if you're not going to get to that, right, you might want to think about some of the successful models that are out there that don't have that. Like I think Breakthrough Collaborative is one of them, where they have college age students, like often education students, working with children and youth, but they also have an academic teacher who acts as a coach. So think about the different ways that you can provide sort of the support and development to the people who are going to be in front of the students.
I was just about to add that I think, John, that there are a few folks thinking that are aligned the same way with you. I know Senator Coons from Delaware has a big service learning AmeriCorps expansion bill to do exactly what you called for. But I also thank you, Jennifer, for really sort of putting a finer point on the staffing and training, and that in itself can look different. If you're going to have coaches or mentors to sort of offset or even bring value where it's necessary. So that's great. I saw a couple of things in the chat, which leads me to my next question. While my fingers are crossed for, open summer learning again and summer camps and all those things, I hold true to summer. It may not be the case, and we may be looking at some sort of virtual learning environment similar to what we currently are experiencing in school, at least here in DC. What are some of the challenges and opportunities of virtual summer programs, and what can providers and partners do now? Some of this will be out of their control, but I also think you can also advocate for what needs to happen to increase the likelihood of in-person programming for this summer. I will say, I'm sitting on Capitol Hill in DC right now, and our school system has allowed for our after-school provider to do small group in-person after school. So there are definitely ways to get it done, as well as other schools that are doing outdoor learning. So can we talk a little bit about what might be some of the alternatives if we are still in the current situation and do need to explore virtual summer programming? And I think, was it Beth and Jennifer that have been talking about this before?
Beth, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
You go for it, Jennifer.
Okay. So one of the things that I would recommend is to if you haven't done this before, look to some of the school districts and community-based partners who have already done this. So like, for instance, Pittsburgh Public Schools has done a lot. They've learned a lot about sort of providing virtual summer programming that combine both academics and enrichment. Big Fat comes to mind as a community-based organization that managed to pull off and deliver enrichment activities to children and youth last summer. And I think that they learned a lot about that. One of which is just that school districts have learned already, which is like preparing materials. Like if you want kids to be able to do something, you have to make sure that you're getting it to their house in some sort of fashion. But I think that there are also real big differences in how you want to structure your day, the curriculum that you're going to choose and use, And I think that another point that people may want to investigate that Beth has talked about earlier is this idea about relationships. And so to the extent that if you're operating in a virtual environment, can you get somebody in front of kids? Can you group kids by sort of the teachers that they know and they already have relationships with? Because that really jumpstarts things. One of the more challenging things in summer is that there takes time for adults to get to learn sort of like kids and their needs. And that helps make a little bit more effective use of time, and also creates a little bit more feelings of accountability and trust for children. If they've had a positive relationship with that individual, they're more likely to want to engage with them. So those are some thoughts on that. And then I think that there are some districts and community partners that are also planning both, right? Co-planning, so planning on having a in-person model, but then also a virtual model. And another thing, so sort of like planning for both things, because some parents aren't going to want their kids to come back, even if we are able to open it up, we'll have small class sizes anyways, because it's summer, you have outdoors, you have a lot of things going for you during the summer when it comes to operating. But at the same time, thinking about if kids don't want to come, what is it that we can have them do? And then in terms of reading, since we're like Campaign for Grade Level Reading, we may want to think about some of the books at home interventions that have been proven to be effective, like Jimmy Kim's, now I'm blanking on the names of his, do you remember? Project Reads, yes, thank you. And thinking about ways of incorporating that for a broad range of students who may not be able to come in person.
Beth, did you have anything to add there?
Just to kind of reiterate, I think to Jennifer's point that while we kind of all know in person is sort of on average preferable to online programs, I think we want to be careful not to kind of bank so heavily on full in-person reopening such that there's no time left to plan for a quality virtual program. And I think in terms of, kind of to your point, Denise, about the broader political landscape, I think the biggest thing providers or partners can do is kind of lobby for all manner of policies, even outside the education space, that would keep community spread low. Because it's, my read of the evidence we have suggests that reopening in person, at least schools, where community spread is low, does not seem to be a big contributor, right? But it's a little bit tougher to kind of interpret the evidence otherwise. So, we really need to prioritize. We need to prioritize reopening schools over reopening other things. And so to the extent folks can push for that, I think that would be great.
John, I'd love for you to jump in here and talk a little bit more about advocacy at the state and federal level and how we should be thinking about that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to turn a little bit of that to Aaron, I think, if that's okay. But I just wanted to say I totally agree with everything that Jennifer and Beth were just saying about preparing for virtual. But it's also like all alarm bells for me. This is exactly what hasn't worked. This is what is driving inequitable outcomes. It's driving what Emma showed us in her slides. And the notion that, we're going to try to sort of wire this together in some kludgy way for the summer and do the best we can in some virtual thing, when, kids are possibly looking at their phones or completely checked out, is just, it's crazy making to me. So, the last thing Beth said was, we gotta beat this damn thing so that people can be back in person. And we need to be thinking, both Jennifer and Beth said this, and you too, Denise, and maybe Aaron's got thoughts on this. We need the political will and the demand from the market that we think about this like right now, because what we have done over the whole course of this damn thing. I mean, all of us, we sat around a year ago or last March thinking somehow magically this was going to be better in May. I don't know how we thought that now that we've seen how this unfurled. This is going to take a long time. So if we're going to get this right in 4 or 5 months, we cannot start to get this right in May. We will screw this up like we have screwed up everything to date on this. So that takes me back to a different part of the point about parents. But I would hope that some of the political action would come at a local level and potentially even at a federal level would come from parents who are saying, hey, people, this is crazy what's happening with my kids. You need to do something about this. You need to provide resources for this. And so I hope in all of our thinking and our talking, we think about an audience of parents who can help drive a political demand for the kind of outcomes that we know we need.
That's a great point, John. I'm going to put in one more plug on people's advocacy on this, is to advocate for funding streams that don't end at the end of like this school year. Like summer's this weird space, and we have to think about sort of like when funding cuts on and off, and summer programming can often fall in this in-between space. I think we want to be advocating for additional resources to help our children and youth in the summer, during the school year, and over consecutive years.
That's absolutely right. And at the Education Trust, we've been working really hard with our national partners to elevate the urgency of investing right now so that communities and schools will have the supports that they need during the summertime and in the fall. This has been a really great, robust conversation, which I really fully appreciate all of you for your thoughts and your wisdom and your guidance on what is a really compelling and urgent issue. So thank you for this. I think we're now gonna have the opportunity to hear from Erin Dworkin, and I'm excited for this as well. As all of you know, Erin recently took the helm of the National Summer Learning Association, and that organization has been working with school districts, summer learning providers, and funders across the country for more than 20 years. And we are very excited to learn more about that work in next week's Grade Level Reading Learning Tuesdays webinar, which has been in the chat a couple of times. So please get that link. That will feature more from the National Summer Learning Association staff and partners. But for now, Erin, I would really love to hear your thoughts and reflections on what you heard from our panelists today about the potential of summer 2021 being a time to reach and support the children most affected by COVID-19 learning loss. And also, I think also some parting thoughts as well about what do you need from this group of people to make this happen now?
Sure. All right. Well, thank you, Denise, and thanks everyone on this panel, and Emma and John and Jennifer and Beth and Sarah and everyone Campaign for Grade Level Reading for letting me join you. And I was inspired and feel very, very empowered because to know that so many folks and so many creative and partners are working hard on this. So thank you to everyone who's tuned in as well for what you do. So we're here to walk side by side in partnership with everyone to think about these critical issues. And I'll just say a couple quick things. So one, NSLA, if you don't know who we are, you go to our website, summerlearning.org, but we've been around for almost more than 25 years trying to put a spotlight on summer. But when we talk about summer, I would like to just put out that we think of it as a metaphor for inequity, as we've talked about. We think it's the most inequitable time in education. We could talk about that. But it's also a metaphor for opportunity and community. And I love that we've been toggling back and forth between what we need to do today and tomorrow and the next 6 months, but also going back out to a macro level to remind ourselves that we're not doing this in a vacuum, and there are real world events, traumatic world events that have unfolded in the last year, in the last 3 weeks. and our students are not oblivious and not impacted by this, and as their families and our teachers as well. So we have a lot to talk about how do we shape these programs so they are taking all these factors into consideration and are being responsive. And I love what Jen had to say about how we work with so many folks who are maybe experts on trauma-informed care and social emotional learning. And this is also a time when need goes up and money is less. It's a time for hyper creativity and hyper collaboration. And so where we kind of land, I just want to remind people kind of the huge scope of the summer learning community, because it's school districts for certain, but we have libraries, we have parks and recreation, community centers. As students get older, summer youth employment, and John, your points about service and how can we connect the dots between the summer youth employment programs and have them helping in these high dosage tutoring programs. And there's a lot to pull into. There's also our friends in the camping world. And so when you can go, when you get a little bit older and you can go to a summer program outside your community, maybe overnight even, and what can you do? And there are a lot of models of summer school in summer camps and teachers, and then how to use your whole city and all the resources, your whole community as a classroom, as we see in Boston, and now communities as learning hubs. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of innovation, a lot of improvement focus going on. And so I would just, again, underscore the fact that, yes, we need to make sure that we get things right as best we can for the young people this summer and summer 2022, but also for all of us. How do we take a step back and take a deep breath and say, like, what is it that's broken that we want to be fixed and to be different when this is over? Whatever has not been working, we have a chance to fix it. And it doesn't just have to be right now, like as John was describing the MacGyver kind of scotch tape and gum and, we're doing the best we can, but really, like, we have a chance to be strategic. Yeah, there are people who want to put more funding into it right now, but we can be, as advocates and leaders and educators, we have a chance to kind of bring more people to this issue. And I think that's something we need to leverage. This is a huge opportunity. A lot of the challenges that young, especially low-income families face over the summer, and you listed them all beautifully, from whether it's food insecurity and to your parents are working and you have lack of technology. Now, lots of people, many more in this country, have felt those challenges firsthand. It's not just some kind of ephemeral idea of like how hard it is to work when your child is home and school is closed and you're trying to balance all this stuff. The majority of American public have experiences. So I think all of us have a chance to bring many more allies and partners to this conversation and to our work and to our cause. It's not just us by ourselves who we love each other, we support each other, but there's a lot more. And so we have to be strategic about how we bring them in. So just again, remind ourselves again, why it's such a high ROI time, high return on investment. And it is, again, it's not summer just for the 10, 12 weeks sake. That's good. That's good in of itself. And we want to make that feel that it doesn't have to just be a nice to have and now it's a need to have, which it is. But it's also, it's this investment in not just young people, but all these teachers. And I've heard the great examples from Breakthrough Collaborative. Another great example of this is a program called Generation Teach. So we were talking, there are a lot of summer learning programs that if you ask them how they define themselves, they will say, we focus on young people, but we're actually a teacher recruitment pipeline program or a diverse teacher. So if you're a school district saying, is this worth our time? There's a chance to think about not only how do you use your summer program to help young people, but how do you use it to help adults? Most professional development happens in the summer. So how do we use our programs as a form of professional development? That get to, again, what John had said, how do we use the summer as a way to set people up for success into the school year again? So if you want to do new things, I'll just also say it's a time of innovation, and it feels like a little rush, but it is January. We are talking about May and June. We have some time here. You have a time to plan. We have a time to mobilize, and it's a time to innovate. And there's a chance, and what's nice about innovation in the summer, and there's lots of examples where that innovation then was able to be scaled, is we have a contained time to try out and test out new ideas, whether it's new curriculum, new partnerships, new policies, and some different strategies. So we could give you lots of examples. We try and lift up some forms of innovation through our National Summer Learning Awards. We actually do, I'll just plug this, have a Summer Innovation Fellowship right now. It's a $25,000 grant for a leader of color who wants to start a new summer program in an innovative way. And we know just a little money goes a long way. And so the big thing here is, what are the innovative ideas and how can summer be that kind of research and development time. The last two pieces is about integration. And again, we've been talking about it very explicitly, so I'm just going to endorse it, which is there's a chance, everyone wants to work together in education during the school year, but once school starts, everyone's so busy that it's like the YMCA's got to do what they got to do, the school district got to do what you got to do, the after school programs, everyone's doing their thing. There is this chance and a window of opportunity where in the summer, with the flexibility and the less time constraints, where you could bring different silos of education to break down those silos and have them work together. And so I would just, again, our school districts have so much on their plate. They're being asked so much that we have the wonderful out of school time community and all these community groups and all these government agencies that work with the same young people many times. And then we often are not able to connect dots and connect resources. And now there's a chance. And so the victory and the applause will go to the leaders in our communities and our districts who can see the map and can connect dots. And there might be a government agency that has 1,000 vans. No one's coming to any of their rec centers, and they have vans. They could drop off meals. They could drop off curriculum packets. You might have another agency, a youth employment says, we have 6,000 high school students that we're paying, but they can't go to people's job placements. We want them to be put to work. We have the money. Who's going to hire them? And so who's the person that can kind of see across the community and bring all these different resources? And then the last point is about impact, that there's this amazing thing about summer, because by definition, it's a life transition point. And this is important. The summer before your middle school to high school, you were nervous about high school. And if you want to talk to a student about what it takes to graduate college, you want to reach them. And if you're even younger, if you're a student in elementary school, you're looking towards middle school, there's a lot here that's happening in youth development. And so the summer is this amazing time when people are vulnerable, but they're open and they're nervous and they're excited. And the right program with the right relationships and the right intentionality can really make a huge impact in setting them on a different path and direction, introducing them to opportunities. And then the long-term impact, which Jennifer has been able to evaluate and see what programs work. And so, we've been at this for decades. So what's great is we have examples of what works. We do have the will. There is some funding coming, emergency funding. I'd like it to go on forever and not just be in an emergency moment, but Governor Newsom in California and whether there's money being discussed right now in some of these emergency federal bills. And I think there's a lot of legislators who are focused on this. So funding hopefully will come, but then again, do we have the people and the policies and the program practices and the leaders and the partnerships all in place to kind of take that funding and reach all the students that need it in a way they need it and not make it punitive and not make it something that you're being forced to do, but that there's a sense of ownership for learning of students. And that's something we lift up student voice and choice so much more in the out of school time, and summer is a great time to do that. So when we get the students on our side, then it becomes their experience and we can get some success.
Thank you for that, Aaron. And in particular for that last minute reminder, if we get our students on our side, because, they will get agency from this. And I think that's incredibly important. All of the benefits, it's not just academic acceleration, but agency, which is what we want our young people to have. And we need to be thinking about this. And I think talk to young people these days about what they want to do during the summer, and they'll tell you how they think about summer, how they want to use that time. It's exciting for them as it is for a lot of people. So thank you for that very, very important part. We always have to have students centered in these conversations. So I appreciate that. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah because she has been scanning the amazing questions that have come in, and I'm going to do the same while she answers, looks for some of the questions, poses the question. But I just really appreciate you all. Aaron, thank you. John, Jennifer, Beth, Emma. This has been a really great afternoon, and I know we have some more time with you, and we're going to open up the floor. So turning it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Denise. It was an amazing conversation, and you were a wonderful facilitator, kind of guiding us all through that. And Emma, I don't know if you've noticed, but people are ready to go camping with you in the virtual background that you have. So put up some more tents. We're all headed that way. So we have been getting a number of questions, and actually they're still coming in fast and furious now. So we're going to try to get through as many of them as possible. One, I'm going to kind of continue the conversation with you, Erin, but also invite others to jump in. Jennifer English was really kind of inspired about this conversation about partnerships and connecting and taking advantage of summer for implementing these innovative approaches and testing that out. Do you have any examples of communities where silos have been effectively connected, and then those participating agencies and entities get kind of collective credit, so there's not that kind of battling about the impact and advances that they're making together? She says it seems like sometimes summer innovations can get lost in the larger shuffle and not recognized as a significant contributing element for the overall educational landscape. So starting with you, maybe Erin, and then I'd love to hear if others
Sure.
have
And yes, well, thank you for the question. And again, you know, one of the things, and we're lucky, we have to thank our supporters. New York Life Insurance Foundation sponsors the National Summer Learning Awards. We get thousands of applicants. We only have a few, but we've had about 60 winners in the last 15 years for a year. And these are real, it's a very rigorous process, and these are really tremendously effective and inspiring programs, models. And so that you can find them on our websites, and we can lift them up and share them in your community. But three that kind of popped to mind that I'll just share. There's a program in Reading, Pennsylvania called Teachers in the Parks, where a teacher, Matthew Hathaway, who is very focused on this issue of learning loss, but saw that there were a lot of parks that weren't being utilized, and a lot of teachers who had some time, but didn't want to work the whole day. And basically, it's a reading program, very intentional, very creative, but they do them in the parks, under trees, by swimming pools, small groups, on a blanket, with books, with whiteboards, with meals and all this. And then they bring in outside groups. But and the teachers, and I visited the program, love it because they get to know the students. And in a COVID environment, when you have to be outside and spread out in smaller groups, it's a good example of something. And again, the Parks Department wasn't thinking about how can we utilize our parks to promote reading, but you had an example of people kind of bringing different agencies together. In Baltimore, there's a great program. They won our award this past year, Young Audiences, their national organization, but they have taken over, and they run in conjunction with Baltimore Public Schools every summer middle school learning program. And they place a teacher with a certified teacher with an artist, a teaching artist, and they kind of infuse more creativity in the pedagogy of the teaching, and they teach the artists how to use their art and their skills to kind of teach the actual curriculum. So you see how that brings different kind of different sectors, if you will, together around helping students. And then, you know, Boston, we lift up as a big national example, not only at a system level, and Chris Smith does an amazing job organizing every resource there is in the city, and the mayor of how to support every student over the summer. But a good example might be Outward Bound, Thompson Island in Boston, where they are outward bound. They bring people on amazing trips. They have an island. They do a lot of great things. But, you know, working in conjunction with Chris's help, and Boston Public Schools, they were bringing teachers to the island with students and kind of infusing the academic piece with the outward bound piece and bringing all the learning to life in a different setting. So these are examples where kind of silos are breaking down. And then, by the way, once you build that relationship, like we were saying once in the summer, now it continues on during the year. So we can give more, but I'll stop there.
That's wonderful, wonderful examples. Any other examples that folks would like to lift up?
There have been a number of cities who have tried to approach summer from sort of like a city level. And I would say like Boston is clearly one of them, sort of like partnerships at the public schools, community-based organizations, cultural organizations, you know, city youth employment, sort of like bringing resources together. Pittsburgh's another example where they have worked across the city with different sort of like agencies and different sectors to improve access to summer programming and to promote attendance. Dallas had a citywide campaign for summer, Dallas City of Lights. And then there's also been some work in Washington, D.C. as well around this. And it's interesting. Some of their work has been actually, because it's very much a city level effort as well, and coordination across city agencies to be able to serve the community, not just for the youth, but also for families and adults, and how to bring that together at a city level. So I think that there are a number, and those are just a few examples, and places that have strong intermediary organizations for out of school time also are well positioned to take on summer, bring together sort of like different actors from, the city level, community-based organizations, schools, and the business support of the business community or partnership with the business community to be able to pull together something systematic and ambitious that leverages all of the resources within a community.
So there's a great question in here from Lindsay that I really appreciate her lifting up. It says, when we are talking about focusing content that's most important for students to catch up, how do we make sure we aren't lowering standards for students, especially for students with disabilities? Recognizing the diversity of our student population. I love that question. Anybody like to take that on?
I think the New Teacher Project has put out some really good information on how to ensure that kids are still exposed to grade level learning. I can stick the link in a chat in a minute. So you're not lowering the standards, you're actually exposing kids to the standards they should be getting, but you're then finding exactly what they need as scaffolding. And so, in reading, that might be allowing kids to listen to an audiobook of the book that everyone is discussing so that they can still engage on the content, but then also be helping them backfill on some of the basics on phonics to get them up so that next time they can read it.
So. One thing that we found in our study, I think it's important, gets to the staffing piece. So for children that have supports through their individualized education plans, if they're in summer programs, it's very important to provide continuity of support, even if they are not on a 12-month IEP, but to really be thinking about what that implies for the support and staffing that children are going to be needing to engage fully in the summer program.
The only thing I'd like to just kind of add to this is, I think having high standards and the continuity and the handoff, and this is where a lot of these community groups, a lot of times, again, you might not be in the same summer program 5 summers in a row, which is fine. You might go to a new one, you might go to a different one. So the question is, who's talking to the school system and to the teachers and find out what that student needs and what they need to be working on and working with that'll help them, and what does the school expect into the fall, and what are they working towards? And a lot of these community programs, they're hungry for that information. They sometimes don't have access to it, or too often they don't have access to it. And they could be real allies if there's a way in advance that we could kind of find a mechanism to share some information.
Along the same lines, we have another question about how do we continue, especially in a virtual remote environment in the summer and throughout the year. What are some of the best ideas, best practices, good models on how we can continue to reach families and make sure they're kept engaged and feel supported through this pandemic? Aaron?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to jump in. I think it's interesting, depending on the program, and there's a lot of research, surveying that was been going on since the pandemic started. After School Alliance did some great surveying of parents and programs, and we were helping them with the summer ones. And so some of the things you saw were that programs that had long-standing relationships with students and families had better attendance. If you were a brand new program, they didn't know you, they didn't trust you, you didn't have such a deep relationship, that might have been harder. But that in a bizarre way, and there are major digital divide issues, as we know, and that was can't forget what a huge piece that will continue to be. because it's not enough just to have one family have a laptop. If you have 4 students at home, who's going to use it? And the mom or dad needs it for their job. So there's a lot of technology challenges that we still need to figure out. But one thing that, if you got past that, was that I heard from a lot of programs that said, we're actually seeing our parents every day. Because we're seeing them in a way that maybe we only saw them a few times a year, if that, at a parent-teacher conference or a big event. But now I'm looking over their shoulder, I'm talking, and do you have the right, are things in instructions in the language that the families speak, and do you have faculty and teachers who can communicate with the parents? So there's a lot there, but there's an opportunity to engage. And we just live in such a tech dependent world that even if people have computers, people typically have a phone, and can you reach them? So I think there's a lot there that could help, but there are a lot of parent specific intervention strategies that people are doing that have been quite effective that, I'll let others share about, but there's a way to engage folks in a deeper way if we're strategic.
Would anyone else like to chime in on that one? There have been a number of questions that we've gotten around kind of understanding the impact. So how Emma shared the data on what we know about learning loss as a result of COVID-19. We are feeling an urgency about wanting to support children in closing that gap, but also recognizing what you've shared about not wanting to just kind of drill and kill and too much of a focus. So there have been a couple of questions around this. One person is wondering, whether or not or how to incorporate assessment and data, whether pre and post surveys, to understand whether or not the learning loss gap is being addressed over the summer months. Another follow-up question about kind of balancing the need of, needing to show an impact. I've gotten funding for this program. I need to demonstrate to my funders that it was effective, but also realizing that there's other measures of success. So, beyond kind of the pre and post academic assessments, what are some other measures that can show the effectiveness and value and impact of a summer program beyond that? And then also recognizing that even when there is pre and post surveys, that show gains over the summer months, not being able to show kind of move the needle on standardized tests. So any thoughts that you all can share about demonstrating the value and the impact of these programs, both academically to cover the learning loss, but also that whole child measure and, moving the needle overall. John, I think you were jumping in.
Yeah, so I have very strong instincts on both sides of this. The summer is the period when well-off, privileged parents have their kids engaged in activities that are not evaluated. This is the period in which you get to go explore, and there's no grade. Maybe you're crummy at riding horses and it doesn't make any difference. You've had that experience. So on the one hand, I think, oh my God, let's not, do a drill and kill and pre and post on learning and so forth. And at the same time, when Jennifer says there are these citywide initiatives, I get very excited. I think that's great. And I think, just as Jennifer said, this is just the right sort of community level for a sort of a whole rallying cry. But then I'm asking, did any of that work? So they did it in Pittsburgh. Are kids in Pittsburgh doing better than they would have done otherwise? So I think the question is extremely important. I'm curious what people who are more expert in this think about how we evaluate, but don't over-evaluate. Don't turn this into yet another block of time on which we impose some sort of a test. So I'm curious what people think.
And I think a lot of it is what you were talking about before around creating those linkages between all the different players, because there's a lot of data that's out there, and it's how do you link that data? So you don't need to give the kid another test because they've already took iReady right before they left, and they're taking iReady right when they get back. Or there's going to be a set of attendance data that's going to come from the district, and you can see if the kids who went through X summer school end up attending better. And so being able to join up the dots, I think will hopefully enable us not to drill and kill, but also to find the data on what works, because fundamentally we want to be giving these kids both a joyful summer experience, but we want them to start the year, especially if they can't read. I tutor a little boy who can't read in 4th grade. I don't want him starting 5th grade not being able to read, because that's going to be devastating for him. And so how do you link up those points to work out what programs work, so you know how to target the right program for the right kid to really get the results that you want?
Yeah, I think that this is a place where districts can use their current assessment data to be able to track this, so that programs themselves don't have to embed sort of pre and post assessments into what's happening. Although if you're trying to show the effectiveness of your program, like, you will get bigger gains if you use the pre-post than if you look at standardized assessments, or even, are looking at the assessments that are conducted as progress assessments through districts. I think that another indicator to look for is attendance, right? And even though sort of like we say things like districts will have attendance on this, not if they actually don't pay attention to it. Like, it's not one of these things that just translates really easily. And if districts aren't paying attention to it and really reinforcing the need to adequately track the attendance data, it won't be done, and it won't be done well. And so it is one thing that I would look for, like, pretty consistently, like, are kids continuing to attend, and at what rates, and who are you losing, and sort of to dig in why, because it speaks to something about sort of like quality and engagement and interest in programming. And then I would also look towards the research base. So I find that lots of times, like, people almost like feel like they have to reinvent their own study every single time they put on a program. So I do think that people could leverage like really high quality studies that have been conducted with strong levels of evidence, right? And then if they're adopting some sort of model, right, that aligns with that, where they followed that, and then they're actually looking at their own implementation. Like, did we follow it? How did that work? Did we implement this well? And did kids attend? Like, that can also give them some indicators that can also be pretty powerful in teaching them how to improve the program year upon year, instead of just assuming that everything that they intended went off splendidly. Because usually it doesn't. The implementation's really, really challenging. And that is another like benefit of offering programs year after, like summer after summer after summer, is you get better at it. And your programs can become more effective.
Can I just say one quick obvious point that sometimes is overlooked? We sometimes ask programs to measure things that they don't do. And I think it's important that if you are a program that is doing a lot on social emotional learning and teaching leadership and empowering, or family engagement, measure that. And if you haven't done any math tutoring in your program, it's going to be hard for you to show gains and results around that. But somehow we pigeonhole people and say, now measure these things that maybe you have or have not done. So, it comes back to being intentional and being planning. Our guidebook that NSLA puts out says summer starts in September. Because, if you want to think this through, you have to be really thoughtful, and every moment's a teachable moment. And we could get literacy outcomes, and we can get math outcomes and STEM outcomes and a lot of other great things, but we have to have built it into our curriculum and trained our staff and then execute against it. So before we go and measure it.
Yeah, I totally agree, Erin. You've said my most favorite point. And because the other thing is that when you're measuring outcomes that you didn't intentionally teach, right, you're wasting money. And every dollar that we spend on evaluation that is not helpful is a dollar that we didn't spend on a kid. So like when we measure, we need to do it well. We need to do it intentionally. We need to know how we're going to use the data and why we thought we were going to get those outcomes and whether they were realistic, and how they're going to help us serve the children better. Because otherwise we shouldn't do it.
I think I agree with what everyone said about sort of using existing data systems, not, overly focusing on assessment and using existing research. One thing I think that's tricky is that the research on high dosage tutoring and the most effective kinds of programs does seem to suggest that kind of data use and progress monitoring seems helpful in kind of tailoring those programs to student needs. And so it seems to me another potential benefit of partnership with school systems, or partnership between agencies to actually, as opposed to administering your own assessment, to get access to data on where kids are starting out before they come into your summer programs, so that you can group them in certain ways, or tailor your instruction to their particular needs, and instruction and activity if it's not an academic program. So there's also this piece about using data for to drive kind of instruction over the course of the summer.
I mean, that's just such an important point. It applies all the time. And this is always the terrifying piece about data, is basically you want to use data as a guide, and other people want to use data as an assessment of whether something works or doesn't work. And often, when we're going to funders, we want to say it works in this really sharp, nice way with a great graph showing pre and post and so forth. It's just, as you suggest, it's more complicated than that. The assessment, I mean, we all do assessment all day long, and we make adjustments all day long about how we're doing, how others are doing, and so forth. And that's completely appropriate, and it's completely different from the does it work or does it not work kind of assessment, and the way data is too often used.
Thank you. I just wanted to share that somebody shared a comment in the chat box. She wants to have your thoughts published somewhere because she's finding that districts and funders don't share such an enlightened view of measurement. So we're going to come back to you all for the paper after this webinar is over, so that we can get that out there.
Unfortunately, none of us are funders. If we had more money, maybe John. No, I'm just kidding.
You're influencers. You're influencers. Well, we are actually, I was going to try to get in one more question, but I realized that we're coming up to the end of our 90 minutes together. I don't want to have to run over, but I'd like to encourage everybody who's still on the webinar right now to take a quick moment, if you haven't already, and fill out the survey that popped up on your screen about 10 or 15 minutes ago. It really helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And then I would just like to say a huge, huge thank you to our fabulous panel today, to Denise Fort for facilitating this conversation and lifting up all of these key points around equity and fidelity and quality and whole child approaches, to Emma Dorn for returning again 2 weeks in a row to share this important data and insights, underscoring the urgency of this crisis, and then to our amazing panel, to Jennifer Sloan McCombs, John Gompertz, Beth Schuler, and Erin Dworkin. There's so much to do right now to ensure that children have access to high quality summer programming that we couldn't fit it all into this one session. So we've been posting links to the webinar that we've got planned next week. Erin will be returning to join us and to lead a conversation that will include some of the staff from NSLA, along with other national literacy experts and leaders of some of these award-winning programs that he was sharing some examples in his comments today. So I hope that everybody will register now and make plans to join us for that follow-on conversation. There was also a question in the Q&A box we didn't get to, talking about how we could use technology to help children address some of the learning loss. So I'd encourage you to register for the February 9th webinar in the 3 p.m. time slot, looking at ed tech and how we could leverage that to accelerate student learning. We'll have some superintendents along with some leaders of a variety of educational technology tools sharing that. And then, of course, we'll have another Crucible of Practice Salon on February 9th in the earlier 12:30 p.m. time slot. Thank you all for joining in for this conversation, for so many of you staying after our 90 minutes are over. Really appreciate your engagement and hope that you'll continue to be a part of these conversations. And then again, thank you all to our amazing panel. It's been a great conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you all.